Welsh Fairies, carrying mortals through the air. Fairies being creatures of the imagination, it is not possible to classify them by fixed and immutable rules. In the exact sciences, there are laws which never vary, or if they vary, their very eccentricity is governed by precise rules. Even in the largest sense, comparative mythology must demean itself modestly in order to be tolerated in the severe company of the sciences. In presenting his subjects, therefore, the writer in this field can only govern himself by the purpose of orderly arrangement. To secure the maximum of system, for the sake of the student who employs the work for reference and comparison, with the minimum of dullness, for the sake of the general reader, is perhaps the limit of a reasonable ambition. Keatley divides into 4 classes the Scandinavian elements of popular belief as to fairies: the elves, the dwarfs, or trolls, the nisses, 4, the necks, mermen, and mermaids. How entirely arbitrary this division is, the student of Scandinavian folklore at once perceives. Yet it is perhaps as satisfactory as another. The fairies of Wales may be divided into 5 classes, if analogy be not too sharply insisted on. Thus we have, I. The Ellyllon, or elves, 2. The Coblynau, or mine fairies, 3. The Bwbach, or household fairies, 4. The Gwragedd or fairies of the lakes and streams, and 5. The Gwyllion, or mountain fairies. The modern Welsh name for fairies is Y Tylwyth Teg, the fair folk or family. This is sometimes lengthened into Y Tylwyth Teg Y Coed, the fair family in the wood, or Tylwyth Teg Ymwn, the fair folk of the mine. They are seen dancing in moonlight nights on the velvety grass, clad in airy and flowing robes of blue, green, white, or scarlet. Details as to color not usually met, I think, in accounts of fairies. They are spoken of as bestowing blessings on those mortals whom they select to be thus favored, and again are called Bendith y Mamau, or their mother's blessing, that is to say, good little children whom it is a pleasure to know. To name the fairies by a harsh epithet is to invoke their anger. To speak of them in flattering phrase is to propitiate their good offices. The student of fairy mythology perceives in this propitiatory mode of speech a fact of wide significance. It can be traced in numberless lands, and back to the beginning of human history, among the cloud-hung peaks of Central Asia. The Greeks spoke of the Furies as the Eumenides, or gracious ones, Highlanders mentioned by Sir Walter Scott uncover to the gibbet and call it the kind gallows. The Dyak will not name the small pox, but calls it the chief. The Laplander calls the bear the old man with the fur coat. In Amam the tiger is called Oran father, and it is thought that the maxim, "Speak only good of the dead," came originally from the notion of propitiating the ghost of the departed, Carrot, who, in laying off this mortal garb, had become endowed with new powers of harming his late acquaintance. The Ellyllon are the pygmy elves who haunt the groves and valleys, and correspond pretty closely with the English elves. The English name was probably derived from the Welsh el, a spirit, elf, an element. There is a whole brood of words of this class in the Welsh language, expressing every variety of flowing, gliding, spirituality, devilry, angelhood, and goblinism. Ellyllon, the plural of Ellyll, is also doubtless allied with the Hebrew Ellyllon, having with it an identity both of origin and meaning. The poet David ab Gwilym, in a humorous account of his troubles in a mist, in the year 1340, says, Year y doedd ymhob gobant Ellyllon minjamian gant. There was in every hollow 100 wry-mouthed elves. The hollows, or little dingles, are still the places where the peasant, belated on his homeward way from fair or market, looks for the Ellyllon, but fails to find them. Their food is specified in Welsh folklore as fairy butter and fairy victuals, y menyn tylwyth teg and bwyd Ellyllon, the latter the toadstool, or poisonous mushroom, and the former a butter-resembling substance found at great depths in the crevices of limestone rocks, in sinking for interesting, and acquaintance was thereupon easily established on a friendly footing. I led the conversation into the domain of folklore, and this book is richer in illustration on many a page, in consequence. Among others, this tale was told. On a certain farm in Glamorganshire lived Rowli Pugh, who was known far and wide for his evil luck. Nothing prospered that he turned his hand to, his crops proved poor, though his neighbours might be good, his roof leaked in spite of all his mending, his walls remained damp when everyone else's walls were dry, and above all, his wife was so feeble she could do no work. His fortunes at last seemed so hard that he resolved to sell out and clear out, no matter at what loss, and try to better himself in another country, not by going to America, for there was no America in those days. Well, and if there was, the poor Welshman didn't know it. So as Rowli was sitting on his wall one day, hard by his cottage, musing over his sad lot, he was accosted by a little man who asked him what was the matter. Rowli looked around in surprise, but before he could answer the Ellyll said to him with a grin, There, hold your tongue, I know more about you than you ever dreamed of knowing. You're in trouble, and you're going away. But you may stay, now I've spoken to you. Only bid your good wife leave the candle burning when she goes to bed, and say no more about it. With this the Ellyll kicked up his heels and disappeared. Of course the farmer did as he was bid, and from that day he prospered. Every night Catty Jones, his wife, set the candle out, swept the hearth, and went to bed, and every night the fairies would come and do her. Until recently, Welsh women retained their maiden names even after marriage. Their gloves, menig Ellyllon, are the bells of the digitalis, or foxglove, the leaves of which are well known to be a strong sedative. Their queen, for though there is no fairy queen in the large sense that Gwynapnud is the fairy king, there is a queen of the elves, is none other than the Shakespearean fairy spoken of by Mercutio, who comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman. Shakespeare's use of Welsh folklore, it should be noted, was extensive and peculiarly faithful. Keatley in his Fairy Mythology rates the bard soundly for his inaccurate use of English fairy superstitions, but the reproach will not apply as regards Wales. From his Welsh informant Shakespeare got mab, which is simply the Cymric for a little child, and the root carat of numberless words signi fying babyish, childish, love for children, mabgar, kitten, mabgath, prattling, maybeath, and the like, most notable of all which in this connection is R.R. Mabinogi, the singular of Mabinogion, the romantic tales of enchantment told to the young in bygone ages. In the Huntsman's Rest Inn at Peterstone super Ely, near Cardiff, sat a group of humble folk one afternoon, when I chanced to stop there to rest myself by the chimney side, after a long walk through green lanes. The men were drinking their tankards of ale and smoking their long clay pipes, and they were talking about the dogs and horses, the crops, the hard times, and the prospect of bettering themselves by emigration to America. On this latter theme I was able to make myself were tidy, his cattle were sleek, his pigs the fattest in the parish. So things went on for 3 years. One night Catty Jones took it into her head that she must have a peep at the fair family who did her work for her, and curiosity conquering prudence, she arose while Rowli Pugh lay snoring, and peeped through a crack in the door. There they were, a jolly company of Ellyllon, working away like mad, and laughing and dancing as madly as they worked. Catty was so amused that in spite of herself she fell to laughing too, and at sound of her voice the Ellyllon scattered like mist before the wind, leaving the room empty. They never came back any more, but the farmer was now prosperous, and his bad luck never returned to plague him. The resemblance of this tale to many he has encountered will at once be noted by the student of comparative folklore. He will also observe that it trenches on the domain of another class in my own enumeration, viz. that of the Bwbach, or household fairy. This is the stone over which one is constantly stumbling in this field of scientific research. Mr. Baring Gould's idea that all household tales are redicable to a primeval root, in the same or a similar manner that we trace words to their roots, though most ingeniously illustrated by him, is constantly involved in trouble of the sort mentioned. He encounters the obstacle which lies in the path of all who walk this way. His roots sometimes get inextricably gnarled and intertwisted with each other. But some effort of this sort is imperative, and we must do the best we can with our mate riles. Stories of the class of Grimm's Witchel Manor, Kinder und Hausmärchen, will be recalled by the legend of Rowli Pugh as here told. The German Hausmänner are elves of a domestic turn. British goblins. Baking and brewing, her washing and mending, sometimes even furnishing of their own tools and materials. The farmer was now always clean of Rowli and the Ellyll. Linen and whole of garb, he had good bread and good beer. He felt like a new man, and worked like one. Everything prospered with him now as nothing had before. His crops were good, his barns sometimes mischievous and sometimes useful, but usually looking for some material reward for their labors. So with the English goblin named by Milton in Allegro, which drudges to earn his cream bowl duly set. The Ellylldan is a species of ELF exactly corresponding to the English will-o'-wisp, the Scandinavian lightgubber, and the Breton sand-yan white-tad. The Welsh word dan means fire. Dan also means allure. The compound word suggests alluring ELF fire. The Breton sand-yan white-tad street. John and Father, is a double ignis fatuus fairy, carrying at its finger ends 5 lights, which spin round like a wheel. The Negroes of the southern seaboard states of America invest this goblin with an exaggeration of the horrible peculiarly their own. They call it Jack-Moo-Lantern, and describe it as a hideous creature 5 feet in height, with goggle eyes and huge mouth, its body covered with long hair, and which goes leaping and bounding through the air like a gigantic grasshopper. This frightful apparition is stronger than any man, and swifter than any horse, and compels its victims to follow it into the swamp, where it leaves them to die. Carrot. Like all goblins of this class, the Ellylldan was, Carrot of course, seen dancing about in marshy grounds, into which it led the belated wanderer. But, as a distinguished resident in Wales has wittily said, the poor ELF is now starved to death, and his breath is taken from him. His light is quenched forever by the improving farmer, who has drained the bog, and, instead of the rank decaying vegetation of the autumn, where bitterns and snipes delighted to secrete themselves, crops of corn and potatoes are grown. A poetic account by a modern character, called Lolo the Bard, is thus condensed. One night, when the moon had gone down, as I was sitting on a hilltop, the Ellylldan passed by. I followed it into the valley. We crossed plashes of water where the tops of bulrushes peeped above, and where the lizards lay silently on the surface, looking at us with an unmoved stare. The frogs sat croaking and swelling their sides, but ceased as they raised a melancholy eye at the Ellylldan. The wild fowl, sleeping with their heads under their wings, made a low cackle as we went by. The bittern awoke and rose with a scream into the air. I felt the trail of the eels and leeches peering about, as I waded through the pools. On a slimy stone a toad sat sucking poison from the night air. The Ellylldan glowed bravely in the slumbering vapors. It rose airily over the bushes that drooped in the ooze. When I lingered or stopped, it waited for me, but dwindled gradually away to a speck barely perceptible. But as soon as I moved on again, it would shoot up suddenly and glide before. The bat came flying round and round us, flapping its wings heavily. Screech owls stared silently at us with their broad eyes. Snails and worms crawled about. The fine threads of a spider's web gleamed in the light of the Ellylldan. Suddenly it shot away from me, and in the distance joined a ring of its fellows, who went dancing slowly round and round in a goblin dance, which sent me off to sleep. Quote, Wales is expressed with fidelity by Shakespeare's words in the mouth of Puck. I'll follow you, I'll lead you about around. Through bog, through bush, through brake, through briar. Sometime a horse'll be, sometime a hound. A hog, a headless bear, someth me afire. And neigh, and bark, and grunt, and roar, and burn. Like horse, hound, hog, bear, fire, at every turn. End quote. The various stories I have encountered bear out these details almost without an omission. In his own proper character, however, Pwca has a sufficiently grotesque elfish aspect. It is stated that a Welsh peasant who was asked to give an idea of the appearance of Pwca, drew the above figure with a bit of coal. The Pwca is but another name for the Ellylldan, as our Puck is another name for the will-o'-wisp, but in both cases the shorter term has a more poetic flavor and a wider latitude. The name Puck was originally applied to the whole race of English fairies, and there still be few of the realm who enjoy a wider popularity than Puck, in spite of his mischievous attributes. Part of this popularity is due to the poets, especially to Shakespeare. I have alluded to the bard's accurate knowledge of Welsh folklore. The subject is really one of unique interest, in view of the inaccuracy charged upon him as to the English fairyland. There is a Welsh tradition to the effect that Shakespeare received his knowledge of the Cambrian fairies from his friend Richard Price, son of Sir John Price, of the Priory of Brecon. It is even claimed that Pwca, or Puck Valley, a part of the romantic glen of the Clydach, in Breconshire, is the original scene of the Midsummer Night's Dream, a fancy as light and airy as Puck himself. Anyhow, there Pwca is, and in the sylvan days, before Frere and Powell's ironworks were set up there, it is said to have been as full of goblins as a Methodist's head is of piety. And there are in Wales other places bearing like names, where Pwca's pranks are well remembered by old inhabitants. The range given to the popular a servant girl who attended to the cattle on the Trwyn farm, near Abergwyddon, used to take food to Master Pwca, as she called the ELF. A bowl of fresh milk and a slice of white bread were the component parts of the goblin's repast, and were placed on a certain spot where he got them. One night the girl, moved by the spirit of mischief, drank the milk and ate most of the bread, leaving for Master Pwca only water and crusts. Next morning she found that the fastidious fairy had left the food untouched. Not long after, as the girl was passing the lonely spot, where she had hitherto left Pwca his food, she was seized under the armpits by fleshly hands which, however, she could not see, and subjected to a castigation of a most mortifying character. Simultaneously there fell upon her ear in good set Welsh a warning not to repeat her offence on peril of still worse treatment. This story is thoroughly believed in there to this day. I visited the scene of the story, a farm near Abergwyddon, now called Abercarn, and heard a great deal more of the exploits of that particular Pwca, to which I will refer again. The most singular fact of the matter is that although at least a century has elapsed, and some say several centuries, since the exploits in question, you cannot find a Welsh peasant in the parish but knows all about Pwca Trwyn. The most familiar form of the Pwca story is one which I have encountered in several localities, varying so little in its details that each account would be interchangeable with another by the alteration of vocal names. This form presents a peasant who is returning home from his work, or from a fair, when he sees a light traveling before him. Looking closer he perceives that it is carried by a dusky little figure, holding a lantern or candle at arm's length over its head. He follows it for several miles, and suddenly finds himself on the brink of a frightful precipice. From far down below there rises to his ears the sound of a foaming torrent. At the same moment the little goblin with the lantern springs across the chasm, alighting on the opposite side, raises the light again of their number repel indignantly the idea that they are superstitious at all, but this would simply be to raise them above the level of our common humanity. There is testimony enough, besides, to support my own conclusions, which accredit a liberal share of credulity to the mining class. The Oswestry Advertiser, a short time ago, recorded the fact that, at Kevin, a woman is employed as messenger at one of the collieries, and as she commences her duty early each morning she meets great numbers of colliers going to their work. Some of them, we are gravely assured, consider it a bad omen to meet a woman first thing in the morning, and not having succeeded in deterring her from her work by other means, they waited upon the manager and declared that they should remain at home unless the woman was dismissed. This was in 1874. In June 1878, the South Wales Daily News recorded a superstition of the quarrymen at Penrhyn, where some thousands of men refused to work on Ascension Day. This refusal did not arise out of any reverential feeling, but from an old and widespread superstition, which has lingered in that district for years, that if work is continued on Ascension Day an accident will certainly follow. A few years ago the agents persuaded the men to break through the superstition, and there were accidents each year. A not unlikely occurrence, seeing the extent of works carried on, and the dangerous nature of the occupation of the men. This year, however, the men, one and all, refused to work. These are examples dealing with considerable numbers of the mining class, and are quoted in this instance as being more significant than individual cases would be. Of these last I have encountered many. Yet I should be high over its head, utters a loud and malicious laugh, blows out its candle and disappears up the opposite hill, leaving the awestruck peasant to get home as best he can. Under the general title of Coblynau I class the fairies which haunt the mines, quarries and underground regions of Wales, corresponding to the Kabbalistic gnomes. The word Coblyn has the double meaning of knocker or thumper and sprite or fiend, and may it not be the original of goblin. It is applied by Welsh miners to pygmy fairies which dwell in the mines, and point out, by a peculiar knocking or rapping, rich veins of ore. The faith is extended, in some parts, so as to cover the indication of subterranean treasures generally, in caves and secret places of the mountains. The Coblynau are described as being about half a yard in height and very ugly to look upon, but extremely good-natured, and warm friends of the miner. Their dress is a grotesque imitation of the miner's garb, and they carry tiny hammers, picks and lamps. They work busily, loading ore in buckets, flitting about the shafts, turning tiny windlasses, and pounding away like madmen, but really accomplishing nothing whatever. They have been known to throw stones at the miners, when enraged at being lightly spoken of, but the stones are harmless. Nevertheless, all miners of a proper spirit refrain from provoking them, because their presence brings good luck. Miners are possibly no more superstitious than other men of equal intelligence. I have heard some by what we now call fire damp, which hurled him and his companions right and left upon the dark rocks, scorching, burning, and killing. Those who survived were not likely to question the existence of the mine fiend. Hence arose the superstition, now probably quite extinct, of basilisks in the mines, which destroyed with their terrible gaze. When the explanation came, that the thing which killed the miner was what he breathed, not what he saw, and when chemistry took the fire damp from the domain of fairy, the basilisk and the fire fiend had not a leg to stand on. The explanation of the knockers is more recent, and less palpable and convincing. The Coblynau are always given the form of dwarfs, in the popular fancy, versus Heribus seen or heard. They are believed to have escaped from the mines or the secret regions of the mountains. Their homes are hidden from mortal vision. When encountered, either in the mines or on the mountains, they have strayed from their special abodes, which are as spectral as themselves. There is at least one account extant of their secret territory having been revealed to mortal eyes. I find it in a quaint volume, of which I shall have more to say, printed at Newport, Monmouthshire, in 1813. It relates that one William Evans, of Havodarvel, while crossing the Beacon Mountain very early in the morning, passed a fairy coal mine, where fairies were busily at work. Some were cutting the coal, some carrying it to fill the sacks. Sorry if any reader were to conclude from all this that Welsh miners are not in the main intelligent, church-going, newspaper-reading men. They are so, I think, even beyond the common. Their superstitions, therefore, like those of the rest of us, must be judged as a thing apart, not to be reconciled with intelligence and education, but coexisting with them. Absolute freedom from superstition can come only with a degree of scientific culture not yet reached by mortal man. It can hardly be cause for wonder that the miner should be superstitious. His life is passed in a dark and gloomy region, fathoms below the earth's green surface, surrounded by walls on which dim lamps shed a fitful light. It is not surprising that imagination, and the Welsh imagination is peculiarly vivid, should conjure up the faces and forms of gnomes and Coblynau, of phantoms and fairy men. When they hear the mysterious thumping which they know is not produced by any human being, and when in examining the place where the noise was heard they find there are really valuable indications of awe, the sturdiest incredulity must sometimes be shaken. Science points out that the noise may be produced by the action of water upon the loose stones in fissures and potholes of the mountain limestone, and does actually suggest the presence of metals. In the days before a priestly had caught and bottled that demon which exists in the shape of carbonic acid gas, when the miner was smitten dead by an invisible foe in the deep bowels of the earth, it was natural his awe-struck companions should ascribe the mysterious blow to a supernatural enemy. When the workman was assailed, suddenly grim copper-colored countenance and a fierce look. The young people ran to Ellylldan house and called the elders out, but though they hurried quickly to the field the dwarfs had already disappeared. The counterparts of the Coblynau are found in most mining countries. In Germany, the Wichteln, little whites, are little old long-bearded men, about 3/4 of an ell high, which haunt the mines of the southern land. The Bohemians call the Wichteln by the name of Hausschmidlin, little house smiths, from their sometimes making a noise as if laboring hard at the anvil. They are not so popular as in Wales, however, as they predict misfortune or death. They announce the doom of a miner by knocking 3 times distinctly, and when any lesser evil is about to befall him they are heard digging, pounding, and imitating other kinds of work. In Germany also the kobolds are rather troublesome than otherwise, to the miners, taking pleasure in frustrating their objects, and rendering their toil unfruitful. Sometimes they are downright malignant, especially if neglected or insulted, but sometimes also they are indulgent to individuals whom they take under their protection. When a miner therefore hit upon a rich vein of ore, the inference commonly was not that he possessed more skill, industry, or even luck than his fellow workmen, but that the spirits of the mine had directed him to the treasure. The intimate connection between mine fairies and the whole race of dwarfs is constantly met throughout the fairy mythology, and the connection of horses' backs, and so on, but all in the completest silence. He thought this a wonderful extra-natural thing, and was considerably impressed by it, for well he knew that there really was no coal mine at that place. He was a person of undoubted veracity, and what is more, a great man in the world, above telling an untruth. That the Coblynau sometimes wandered far from home, the same chronicler testifies, but on these occasions they were taking a holiday. Egbert Williams, a pious young gentleman of Denbighshire, then at school, was one day playing in a field called Cae Caled, in the parish of Bwbach, with 3 girls, one of whom was his sister. Near the stile beyond Ellylldan house they saw a company of 15 or 16 Coblynau engaged in dancing madly. They were in the middle of the field, about 70 yards from the spectators, and they danced something after the manner of Morris dances, but with a wildness and swiftness in their motions. They were clothed in red like British soldiers, and wore red handkerchiefs spotted with yellow wound round their heads. And a strange circumstance about them was that although they were almost as big as ordinary men, yet they had unmistakably the appearance of dwarfs, and one could call them nothing but dwarfs. Presently one of them left the company and ran towards the group near the stile, who were direfully scared thereby, and scrambled in great fright to go over the stile. Barbara Jones got over first, then her sister, and as Egbert Williams was helping his sister over they saw the Goblin close upon him, and barely got over when his hairy hand was laid on the stile. He stood leaning on it, gazing after them as they ran, whither the dwarfs with the mountains is equally universal. God, says the preface to the Ellylldan Goblin, gave the dwarfs being, because the land and the mountains were altogether waste and uncultivated, and there was much store of silver and gold and precious stones and pearls still in the mountains. From the most ancient times, and in the oldest countries, down to our own time and the New World of America, the traditions are the same. The Old Norse belief, which made the dwarfs the current machinery of the northern sagas, is echoed in the Catskill Mountains with the rolling of the thunder among the crags where Hendrik Hudson's dwarfs are playing ninepins. The Bwbach, or Bwbach, is the good-natured goblin which does good turns for the tidy Welsh maid who wins its favour by a certain course of behaviour recommended by long tradition. The maid, having swept the kitchen, makes a good fire the last thing at night, and having put the churn, filled with cream, on the whitened hearth, with a basin of fresh cream for the Bwbach on the hob, goes to bed to await the event. In the morning she finds, if she is in luck, that the Bwbach has emptied the basin of cream, and plied the churn dasher so well that the maid has but to give a thump or two to bring the butter in a great lump. Like the Ellyll which it so much resembles, the Bwbach does not approve of dissenters and their ways, and especially strong is its aversion to total abstainers. There was a Bwbach belonging to a certain estate in Cardiganshire, which took great umbrage at a Baptist preacher who was a guest in the house, and who was much fonder of prayers than of good ale. Now the Bwbach had a weakness in favour of people who sat around the hearth with their mugs of CWRW dar and their pipes, and it took to pestering the preacher. One night it jerked the stool from under the good man's elbows, as he knelt pouring forth prayer, so that he fell down flat on his face. Another time it interrupted the devotions by jangling the fire irons on the hearth, and it was continually making the dogs fall a-howling during prayers, or frightening the farm boy by grinning at him through the window, or throwing the maid into fits. At last it had the audacity to attack the preacher as he was crossing a field. The minister told the story in this wise. I was reading busily in my hymn book as I walked on, when a sudden fear came over me and my legs began to tremble. A shadow crept upon me from behind, and when I turned round, it was myself. My person, my dress, and even my hymn book. I looked in its face a moment, and then fell insensible to the ground. And there, insensible still, they found him. This encounter proved too much for the good man, who considered it a warning to him to leave those parts. He accordingly mounted his horse next day and rode away. The boy of the neighborhood, whose veracity was, like that of all boys, unimpeachable, afterwards said that he saw the Bwbach jump up behind the preacher, on the horse's back. And the horse went like lightning, with eyes like balls of fire, and the preacher looking back over his shoulder at the Bwbach, that grinned from ear to ear the same confusion in outlines which exists regarding our own Bogie and Hobgoblin gives the Bwbach a double character, as a household fairy and as a terrifying phantom. In both aspects it is ludicrous, but in the latter it has dangerous practices. To get into its clutches under certain circumstances is no trifling matter, for it has the power of whisking people off through the air. Its services are brought into requisition for this purpose by troubled ghosts who cannot sleep on account of hidden treasure they want removed, and if they can succeed in getting a mortal to help them in removing the treasure, they employ the Bwbach to transport the mortal through the air. This ludicrous fairy is in France represented by the Goblin. Mothers threaten children with him. Le Goblin vous mangera, le Goblin vous emportera. Carrot in the English, hobgoblin, we have a word apparently derived from the Welsh hob, to hop, and coblyn, a goblin, which presents a hopping goblin to the mind, and suggests the Pooka, with which the Bwbach is also confused in the popular fancy at times, but should mean in English simply the goblin of the hob, or household fairy. In its bugbear aspect, the Bwbach, like the English bogie, is believed to be identical with the Slavonic bog, asterisk and the baga, of the cuneiform inscriptions, both of which are names for the supreme being. According to Professor Fisk, the ancestral form of these epithets is found in asterisk the Old Aryan baga, which reappears unchanged in the Sanskrit of the Vedas, and has left a memento of itself in the surname of the Phrygian Zeus, Bogios. It seems originally to have den.